Thank you for joining us. I know you're a busy man, and I'm very thankful that you're here, Dr. Zapatera.
Yeah, thank
It
you very much for inviting me.
I'm really thankful for that. I know that that's a lot of info about you, but I think it's really important in these times to ensure that people are understanding that what you're chatting about and what you know and what you have researched, and the combination, the synergy of the science behind some of the, I suppose some people call it spirituality or woo woo or some sort of, some of them are ancient teachings as well, but I just
Mhm.
wanted to ensure that everyone knew your your history, what you have done, where you have been. And I know you're creating new steps. I just feel that then I want to say new paradigms in this world of the medical field, combining this research, your understanding on all this on this complete area, especially the cerebral spinal fluid, which we will talk about very shortly. Um, I sort of want to just start very briefly on how you became interested in the cerebral spinal fluid. Was it, how was it that you really pinpointed that area of the medical research when you were studying or when you were working with, working and studying?
Uh, I mean, that's that's a fascinating question. I was in medical school actually, and I was always interested in um, our energetic bodies in terms of, I was always interested in things like acupuncture and
Right.
massage or healing touch and the
Mm-hmm.
effect of healing touch and seeing the effect of, even a baby being touched, or, I would have acupuncture sessions, for instance. And there was obviously an understanding of the energetic body that was beyond what we were being taught at medical school, even in Boston, for instance. And so I've sort of always had this curiosity of our body as an energetic being. It's not just the sum of its parts, for instance. There's so
Mm.
much more that goes on into the functioning of the body and just the intricacies and the divine manifestations that occur when these things are actually put together and how they work together and things like that. And so I was always interested in books like Carolyn Mace's Anatomy of the Spirit, how herbs and things like homeopathy affect the body. And in medical school, I knew that I was getting a very formal training of anatomy, physiology,
Yeah.
pharmacology, immunology, virology, whatever it might be. And I was doing some research in a cancer lab, and it was actually my wife at the time who, I met her, and she was also interested in holistic sort of health care. And she sort of noticed, she's like, you don't seem so happy. It seems maybe like your like the energy and the vigor of why you went to medical school sort of decreased a little bit. And she was totally right. And so she actually encouraged me to take some time off from. I was in the MD PhD program at the time at Harvard Medical School, and she
Mm.
actually encouraged me to take some time off. And so I talked to all the administrators, and they're like, go and do what you feel like you need to do. We'll keep your spot here. And I was in a cancer lab at the time, and doing very hardcore research on cancer, oncogenes, all sort of the things that you hear about in the news on cancer research. Um, and and so we left, and we actually ended up going to Santa Fe. And in Santa Fe, we started studying polarity therapy, and this was something she had actually found on the internet doing a research of, because she was interested in going to thinking about going to like naturopathy school or something like that. And she's like, that's not really for me. And so she found this polarity therapy, and when we were reading into it, it just seemed like it matched a lot of both of our interests. And essentially, polarity therapy was started by this individual called Dr. Stone. He was an osteopath. He was a chiropractor. He
Wow.
was a doctor of naturopathic medicine. He had traveled to Egypt. He had traveled to India. He had traveled to China, and he had put together this entire health system, which essentially involved four basic principles, which was healing touch, movement, so energetic postures and movement,
Hmm.
diet and nutrition, and
Wow.
then positive mind, sort of thinking how
Right.
what are the things. And so I was like, wow, this is really a really good system. And he integrated a whole bunch of different parts from Chinese medicine, from the meridians and acupuncture, from Ayurvedic medicine, and sort of created this healing touch, body centered um, healthcare system. In that
Mm.
program, there was an individual who was studying craniosacral therapy. And every Friday, we were having these sessions of craniosacral therapy. And so, to me, I'm sort of one of these people that I feel like maybe I'm a little bit, I was open to this healing touch, because I felt, just by getting a few sessions, for instance, of polarity therapy, I had felt immediate changes in my body and in my psyche. And
Mhm.
some person sort of describes it as, if you're creating pure metal, what you do is you boil the metal, boil the metal, boil the metal, boil the metal, and then skim off the top, and you get all the dirt out. And then you
Right.
boil the metal, you boil the metal, you boil the metal, and then you skim off the top again. And
Mhm.
polarity therapy is sort of this boiling of the metal. And stuff will rise. And so then it's our job to sort of notice it rising, and then skimming it off the top, and kind of get into our pure essence in a way. And this individual started doing craniosacral, which is a very, it's a very powerful but subtle healing touch, where you're tapping into, if you, just the words, the cranial and the sacrum,
Yeah.
the cranium and the sacrum. But it's more than just that. And you're really palpating what they call, the natural pulsations of the body and the energetic system and the fluids. You're
Mm.
not just touching skin. You're sort of seeing, can you palpate the subtle movements of even the fluid within the skin, or of the energy within the tissue itself. And so I was getting these sessions of craniosacral therapy as well as polarity, and I was having these quite incredible energetic releases. I had a knot in the middle of my solar plexus. You could probably say for 5 or 7 years, to be honest with you. And I'd
Wow.
done, I'd done some work around it, and it was always there, always there. And I got some sessions of craniosacral therapy and polarity therapy. And one day, in the middle of a session, I just start bawling, just start crying out of nowhere, out of absolutely nowhere, just start crying. And for 20 minutes, just start having this just
Wow.
like release of energy, right?
Yeah.
Since from that day on, no, I've not had any solar plexus issues, no tightening of the solar
Wow.
plexus or anything like that. And I would call that, maybe some anxiety, nervousness, stress,
Yeah.
whatever it might be,
Mhm.
totally, totally released. I started noticing, when they were doing some sessions of me, just some incredible visions and sensations of what I would consider oneness with the totality of all, for instance. And I
Mhm.
can't really describe it beyond that. It just sort of felt like this energy arose or was
Mhm.
unveiled. And I felt as if, as cliche as it might be, it was all one. That there was really no separation between this energy and myself, my physical body and myself. And my experiences of this, because I was so interested in it, that what we would do in class and during lunch is, some of the students that were interested in this craniosacral therapy, we would literally, like, we would have an hour and a half of lunch, and we would just, for 45 minutes, I would just hold somebody's, I would hold their cranium like this, and
Wow.
just really feel, we were taught to get to center ourselves to neutral, be, center, ground, neutral, feel your
Yes.
feet on the ground, center
Yeah.
yourself, ground yourself.
Yeah.
And then so we touch. And even if, I'm kind of like one of those people that, even if this does absolutely nothing, if I'm centering, grounding myself, and neutralizing myself during this experience, it's sort of it's a good practice for me.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
but I was also palpating, right? And so I'm kind of like a like an open skeptic, let's say. I go into
Okay.
things skeptical, but
Yep.
I've done enough research to be like, there's no way that that's going to happen. And then you set up the experiment, and you're like, wow, that was amazing, right? And so you're
Yeah.
open to these possibilities, but you really want to set up the experiments. And so with human personalities and human contact, well, what's the experiment? Well, here's my experience, right? Like,
Yeah.
so here's my experience of holding somebody's occiput for 45 minutes, and we would do this for 4 weeks in a row. And I would have the same, I would have the same. So we would switch, and then they would hold my occiput for 45 minutes, and you'd start feeling just these really subtle sort of pulsations or movements. And what happened during some of those experiences was I really felt like this energy that was all just all pervasive. Um, that I was feeling it. It was almost like it was condensing, and I was feeling it as if it was sort of morphing and condensing itself in my third ventricle. And I had enough, because I had gone to medical school, I had enough understanding of the anatomy that
Mm-hmm.
when these sort of subtle when I felt something subtly, I could try to track it to the anatomy that was present
Brilliant.
in our body, right?
Yeah.
So I'm like, that's the third. That's the third ventricle, right? So I'm feeling this sort of like it's almost like this. I wouldn't call it, maybe anointing, or just sort of whatever it is, but it sort of felt like it, like a pulsation into the third ventricle, and then from the third ventricle, I was feeling it sort of spread throughout my cranium, spread throughout my entire being, spread throughout my spinal cord, down into my sacrum, spread then throughout my entire body, spread to to my hands, and then even beyond, where you would say, well,
Mm.
where do you start and where do you end? That I wouldn't really have I wouldn't have an answer for you, but I wasn't dissociated, because our number one training was grounding yourself, feeling your
Yeah.
back against the table, feeling your butt against the table, really feeling that physical contact of the table. And so that was it was sort of like, wow, I really feel this oneness, this
Mm.
lack of boundary of my body, but yet I feel my back on the table. I feel totally grounded in
Yeah.
this
Cool.
experience, right?
Yes.
And so I was like, wow, this is really incredible. We need to sort of look at this a little bit closer. And so then, a few days later, I remember the craniosacral teacher said, um, well, so I was open. He's like, well, it's really about the movement of the cerebrospinal fluid, and how the cerebrospinal fluid is one molecule away from ocean water.
Yes.
And I was like, and so that triggered just an enormous
Absolutely.
amount of, because here I am in medical school going like, I don't think that the cerebrospinal fluid is one molecule away from ocean water, right? Like that
Yeah.
would be like, first of all, what is ocean water? Saline and this and that. But I know that there's proteins in it, and I know that so I kind of had this, I'm like, that doesn't seem like an accurate statement, right? So
Yeah.
there's this discernment that's still occurring, right? So I'm still a scientist. I'm still sort of a medical scientist. That's like, that doesn't seem like an accurate statement. Let me assess that. And when I went to assess that myself, I realized, well, first of all, it's not one molecule away from the ocean. It's many different molecules away from the ocean. But and we can get into the relationship to the ocean in future, in in 10 or 15 minutes or whatever.
Yeah.
But what happened is I started realizing, so I go into, well, what is known about the cerebrospinal fluid? So at first I asked what's in it, and there was very little known about it. And I was like,
Mm.
wow, this is amazing. Here's this fluid, right? That's in the middle of our brain. It's, we have cavities that are formed that have this fluid in it. And
Yeah.
I'm like, what is in it? Because I had known that, we were entering into the world of proteomics, which was characterizing all different types of proteins
Cool.
in systems.
Right.
Systems biology was blossoming at Harvard. We had some of the best machines to take out a sample of tissue or fluids and analyze it at the sort of at the finest molecular level. And I was like, wow, with all this thing that we have, we don't really know exactly what's in the cerebrospinal fluid, or
Mm.
b what this fluid actually does. We've always sort of said that it buffers the brain, it helps with nutrition, and it gives electrolytes to the brain, but that those were sort of generalized statements of, it's this fluid compartment that the brain is sort of housed in, for instance. And so that question essentially led me down this entire field of
Yeah.
trying to understand. The first question was just, what's in this fluid, right?
Yeah.
And I went back. So then I had this entire, like, it was sort of like that spark that my wife noticed was gone, all of a sudden reemerged. I go back to Harvard. I change labs. I find somebody who was willing to support me in this question, and it really didn't come until I was looking at these slides of embryos, and I see this slide of an embryo, and the brain, the part of the embryo that's going to form the brain, and this was an embryo at about 8 weeks. It was a human embryo at about 8 weeks of development. The
Mm.
part of the brain that forms the actual cortex, our
Hmm.
thinking part of the brain, was about, I'm trying to sort of show you on camera, but it was about this thin, right, comparatively.
Right.
And I
Yeah.
was like, I'm like, okay, that's the brain. That's going to become the cortex,
Yeah.
what we think about the brain. And then the space between the different parts of the brain was about this large. So there was
Wow.
space in there. And inside this space was a huge cauliflower like shape. And I go, what's that shape in there? To one of my colleagues who's sitting right next to me, he goes, oh, that's the choroid plexus. And I go, that, literally my eyes lit up and was just like, that's the choroid plexus? The choroid plexus was about this big. The cortex that was going to form the brain was about this big. So in
Wow.
comparison, I was like, wait, if that, the choroid plexus is the structure that makes the cerebrospinal fluid. So I was like, if that's the choroid plexus, and that's creating this fluid has to be important in development. It's just like, what is this fluid doing in development that we've never studied? And that then I started looking at, can we isolate this fluid from embryos? Can we actually study this to see what are the components of this fluid early on in embryologic development? See how this fluid changes. See if we can, you know, culture cells with this fluid. Can this fluid actually sustain life? What do the cells do if they're in contact with the fluid? And so that led to my entire PhD dissertation,
Wow.
which was an incredible experience. Probably one of the most challenging things I've ever done in my life, but hugely important for my personal development and everything. Because while I was studying this, while I was in the lab isolating fluid, trying to grow, tissue with different types of fluids and stuff like that, my
Mm.
wife and I had also decided to go and become certified in craniosacral therapy. So imagine, every 3 months we take off and we fly to Boulder and we go into a 5-day intensive workshop. And so I'm getting this sort of, I'm getting this experience from a craniosacral perspective. I'm getting sessions, I'm giving
Mm.
sessions, but I'm also getting informed by this fluid by doing, hardcore research in the lab on this. So I was kind of getting this information from all these multiple sources and sort of putting it together. And that's when, I defended my PhD, and then my, more of my, let's say, interest in the fluid as a potential conveyor of what I call sort of the source energy into our physical bodies became more that became sort of more of my personal research or practice. And so that's obviously a long answer, but it really
No,
is that complex in terms of how did I get to that, because my wife was hugely instrumental in help guiding me. This guy Jeffrey Wilson, who was doing craniosacral therapy, and said, hey, it's one way, it's one molecule away from seawater, and having that skeptical of like, no, let's actually look, let's not really take everything that people say, as truth. Let's is it
yeah,
is that really true, right? It wasn't true, but it didn't matter, because the fact that it wasn't true, it's like, well, what is in the cerebrospinal fluid, so that we really know. And then it was sort of like, oh, we don't really know what is in the cerebrospinal fluid, so can we find out? I was sort of in a perfect position to say, can we find out? And I go back to Harvard, and across the street from me is the guy who is, the world expert in proteomics, and how to isolate proteins out of a fluid. And so I go over to him and I say, look, I want to study the cerebrospinal fluid. And he's like, great, bring me a sample of a fluid, right? And it was just, what was funny is we didn't know what to expect. And so, and that's the cool part of research is I bring him this fluid, it's totally clear. And I do know, I know that there were some people who literally didn't expect there to be anything, like just
right. Yeah.
didn't expect it, just a clear fluid with some salts, some sodium chloride, maybe potassium, stuff like that, but that we wouldn't really find. And I remember I get the call from him, and and I was talking to my boss at the time, and he says, yeah, I got your analysis back. And I go, oh, great. Did you find anything? He's like, oh yeah, there's about 277 proteins that we found. And I was like, my eyes just dropped. And my boss looks at me and he goes, well, did he find anything? Right? Is there anything in the fluid? And I'm like, he found something. And
Yeah, cool.
and I remember sort of leaving his office and running across the street and looking at it and being like, wow, this is, like, this was our first, sort of large analysis of the proteins in the cerebrospinal fluid. And that then led to other studies and really characterizing the proteins. And, if anybody's interested in sort of reading the whole dissertation, it is on
Hmm.
my website at holdingspace.com for free. You can just download it and
Cool.
have it. But it goes into various sort of experiments of what we did with the cerebrospinal fluid itself, how it changes from the embryo into adults, and then sort of our hypotheses of what it did, very specific experiments on what it did, um, using both mice and rats, as models, and really characterizing it. And now, if you pick up Time Magazine or the New York Times, the cerebrospinal fluid has sort of exploded
Yes.
as a hugely important fluid that now we're starting to understand as, wow, this is really important. And
Really
I
integral.
just, yeah, I just love that, because it's starting to show some of the importance of this fluid, and things that, I mean, just some of the interesting discoveries that have made in terms of what it's doing to our brains during sleep, and how it's
Okay.
cleansing our brains during sleep, and
Mm.
how these pulsations of fluid through our brain, and all that just gets into so many numerous pathways of discussions that I'll just leave it at that and see
Oh God,
where
yeah.
you want to
Look,
go.
yeah, you've opened a door to new paradigms, and to a new way of being, to an understanding that. I mean, it must have been so exciting to actually get that fluid and say, let's see what's in it, and just get that information back, and to be experiencing like the medical research and then doing your craniosacral therapy, and just understanding both worlds is really
That's
quite
exactly what was
unique.
happening. Yep.
It's quite unique to the medical field, and to understand how it works, like in all areas, energetically, and physically, is just so it's such a breakthrough. It's so great because you're experiencing it yourself, and you're able to
Exactly.
speak from not just it's my experience, but experience that involves your your research and your deep understanding through the study that you've done. So it's just brilliant. It's a very exciting time, really, to be understanding and to be where you are, and really at the beginning, at the press, of what is going to just become something so important for us in future generations to understand. And I think you have started like I said, I was looking years ago for information about this, cerebral spinal fluid, about how it works, and I heard the 1 molecule away from seawater, and I was like, really? How does that work? How do I find out more about that? And you were the only person that came up, and there were only a few YouTube videos of you back then, talking about the cerebrospinal fluid, but there's a lot more available now, which I'm glad to hear and see, and also on your holdingspace.com website. So there's a lot of information there. I know you've got your blog and your meditations and all your information. So Dr. Zapatero, what I'd like to ask you is, obviously, CSF is really filled with proteins and affects our lives in different ways. But what is the, I mean, we don't have all day to talk about this, and I would love to, but obviously there are certain aspects of the cerebral spinal fluid that works through the body and with the body, physically and energetically. How does it affect? How does it affect our life and our body if we are connected to the cerebral spinal fluid consciously?
So, so first of all, let's go through some of the roles that we absolutely know that it does. All right. So
Okay,
we know that the
that'd be good.
cerebrospinal.
You're the expert.
What's that?
That'd be good, knowing that you're the
Yeah. So
expert.
let's,
Yeah.
let's. It's hugely important in development. It bathes your entire, every single cell that becomes your nervous system is
Mm-hmm.
bathed in the cerebrospinal fluid when you're a tiny little embryo in your mother's womb. So I'm publishing a book on this, on these sorts of concepts, which are also present in my talks. But that's, so first of all, that's hugely important because every single cell
Mm-hmm.
that develops into our nervous system was bathed in this fluid in the womb as an embryo. We know that even as an embryo, it's transporting nutrients, very important nutrients. It's transporting hormones. It's transporting growth factors. It's
Mm-hmm.
still doing that today. We know of
Mm-hmm.
growth factors, for instance, in the cerebrospinal fluid that are helping in terms of developing new neurons and things like that. Um, so it's already we already know it to be a signal for growth factors. Okay, it regulates things like circadian rhythms, which is our sleep wake cycle. And so there's a lot of studies that have been done in terms of melatonin being released into the cerebrospinal fluid by the pineal gland, and the pineal gland is in the posterior part of our third ventricle, and that's
Right.
secreting melatonin when the when our visual cortex gets, when our eyes see less light, melatonin starts to be released by the pineal gland, and you see concentrations of melatonin dramatically increase in the cerebrospinal fluid. And then if you don't, if you just accept these rhythms as natural rhythms of life and not try to stay up and watch your favorite show or whatever it is, and when it gets dark enough, you get tired and you close your eyes, you'll then fall into a sleep. And so it's regulating circadian rhythms through the transport of things like melatonin. It regulates things like appetite. So there are actually proteins found in the CSF that control appetite.
Mm.
It creates an ionic balance. So the
Mm.
importance of electrolytes and sort of creating an ionic balance for cells, sort of homeostasis, right? It eliminates waste. It's number one waste eliminator, for instance, in our brain. And what they've just shown is amazingly. So imagine, so we all think of like this cerebrospinal fluid being housed in these ventricles and around the outside of the brain, and the ventricles are those little cavities inside the brain.
Mm.
And what was fascinating when we had done the analysis was that we had looked at the analysis of the proteins, and we found a lot of what we call extracellular matrix proteins in it. Extracellular matrix, if you just kind of take that word apart, extra means outside of, cellular means outside of the cell. So extracellular matrix, and then the matrix is sort of this interconnection, this web of proteins. And what we found was that we actually found these proteins in the cerebrospinal fluid, but it was just, it
Um,
wasn't in between cells, it was in a liquid. So I sort of described it as a less differentiated form, like a more liquid form of the extracellular fluid that you find between cells. And amazingly, the new discoveries came out that showed that while we sleep, we
mhm.
actually sort of, our brain has these little channels, or sort of opens up to these pulsations and flow of cerebrospinal fluid from the ventricles into the brain tissue itself, and it clears out, it eliminates the waste that was building up during the day from just our normal thinking, whatever it might be, and it eliminates that waste.
Wow.
And so sleep and the function of the cerebrospinal fluid and sleep is hugely important in terms of, we need to get, finally we're understanding why we need to get sleep, because sleep is so important for cleansing our brain from the toxins that build up during the day. And this is actually done by the brain changing the way that its proteins are structured, such that the cerebrospinal fluid can flow, because usually it doesn't flow so much from the ventricles into the brain itself, but can
Yeah.
actually flow from the ventricles into the brain tissue, clears it out, and then gets resorbed into the body and goes back into our system and gets, it becomes blood again, and then we purify it, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the things that, if people ask is like, well, what is the main function of the sea at this point? Like, what I would say is from a, from what we know, from a very, it cleans the brain, and it brings transports,
Wow.
transports nutrients, it transports hormones, it transports growth factors, it transports things like melatonin. Um, but it cleans the brain when we sleep, and therefore we need to get a good amount of sleep so that we can open up these channels, the CSF can flow through, and then let's say these channels open, and now we're up. We have a clean, we have a clean brain, in essence. We can think.
That's
You know,
it.
we
So what? Okay, this might sound a really naive question, but when you say clean the brain and the toxins of the brain, I mean, what does that mean? When because what's happening in the brain that we're
just
creating toxins? How does that work? What do you mean? What do you
everything.
mean?
Yeah, everything. Reactive oxygen species that build up from just normal metabolism. Just the normal
Right.
metabolism of thinking and being alive will create sort of toxins or garbage that needs to be disposed of properly. It happens all the
Okay.
time. It's not anything that is, it's not anything that's bad or wrong. It just
No, no.
happens through normal metabolism.
Yep.
And
Yep.
so and so our bodies are really good at doing things like that. And
Yeah.
but when we force it, when we don't do things like that, like when we don't get good enough sleep, or when we you know whatever it might be, uh, that the toxins can build up. And if the toxins build up enough, then there's a certain sort of concentration of, let's say, reactive oxygen species, that below a certain concentration, they're not having so much effect on cells or cell membranes or DNA or anything like that, so they're not ruining anything. Once they get to a certain concentration, then they start ruining, they start damaging cells, and they start damaging tissues, and things like that. And so we want to eliminate those. And the cerebrospinal fluid comes in, and sort of, what we think of it as doing is, it just sort of comes in and it washes everything away.
Okay.
And so it's not anything that, it's not like when I say toxin, like, oh, you're totally, you have all these toxins building up. This is just
No.
natural metabolism that occurs, that creates these sort of byproducts that if they sit around and they get too high in concentration, that they start to damage the cells. We have a great way of, our blood supply constantly replenishing things, and our CSF, if we sleep, constantly replenishing things, coming in and sort of clearing it out. No big deal. But if you don't do it, now the studies are
Mm.
going to be done that, okay, if people don't get sleep, do the toxins really build up, and do they cause things like Alzheimer's, dementia? Do they cause things like, headaches, for instance? Like when you wake up in the morning and you have a headache, could that be that the cerebrospinal fluid didn't clear the toxins well throughout, that built up throughout the day, or whatever it might be? We don't know the answers to those questions yet, but my hypothesis would be that we'll probably find something like that. That we'll notice that the importance of sleep is really to help decrease these toxins that just build up, so that over time they don't get stuck in the brain and cause things like neurodegeneration
Right.
or dementia or things like that. And then the other aspect of that would be, well, does that happen only during sleep? Because
Mhm.
sleep would be, let's say, an altered sense of consciousness. And so could you actually induce that during states of meditation or during
Mhm.
profound states of parasympathetic response? Sleep, we sort of think of like a parasympathetic activity. And so therefore, could getting healing touch work, where you get into this really deep state of relaxation, even if it's for 20 or 30 minutes? Could that create this sort of opening and the flow of the cerebrospinal fluid through your brain tissue? Could deep states of meditation cause that?
Mhm.
And so those are questions that are just interesting to me, because I doubt that it's just during sleep, right? There's some sort of
Yes.
physiologic response, of the nervous system being in a very, very restful state, feeling like it's totally supported, and then all of a sudden something opens up,
Mm.
and
Mm.
now that the let's say the little gateways that were holding the cerebrospinal fluid in the ventricles now opens up,
Mm.
and it allows it into the parenchyma. This is my hypothesis. It hasn't been studied yet. We need to do the same studies that they did with the fMRIs and all those cool things that they looked at, in terms of people being in deep states of meditation, and seeing, does that actually cause this same cerebrospinal fluid flow. But I would sort of, my hypothesis is that it
Does.
does.
Yeah.
Um, so that's just kind of something to think about. If you go into a state of meditation, you feel really clear or rejuvenated afterwards. Was there some mechanism that actually was able to open in the brain that caused this cerebrospinal fluid to flow? Um, and then, from a more what I call, not yet fully studied perspective, is, this
Pretty
concept
scientific. Yep.
of the cerebrospinal fluid as being a vehicle and a conductor of energy. And so we know that it conducts molecules. We know that it
Mm-hmm.
transports nutrients and growth factors. We know that it transports melatonin. We know that there's this pulsation. We know that it moves. We know, for instance, that our breath can control the flow of the CSF. We know that our heart rate can control the movement of our CSF in our bodies. And so all I tell people is look at the anatomy of the ventricles, study the anatomy of where the fluid is, study the anatomy of the third ventricle, which is this
Mm-hmm.
midline space that's sort of a vertical sort of wall like this, with the pituitary gland in front, the pineal gland in back.
Mm.
Know how it connects to the lateral ventricles, which are these amazing ventricles on both sides of your hemispheres.
Mm-hmm.
Know
Mm-hmm.
that there's a tube that goes all the way down the central part of your spine. So in your spine, you have a
Mm-hmm.
tube, right? You have a hole that goes all the way down, and in that hole, there's cerebrospinal fluid in that little hole that goes down. It goes all the way down your spinal cord and on the outside as well, and it bathes your entire. It goes all the way down to like S1 in your or S2 or S3 in your sacrum. So you have a sacral pool, you have a ventricular pool, you have in the back of your head, the cisterna magna. So we have all these kind of pools of cerebrospinal fluid, and wherever it might be interesting to you, just bring your awareness. Just bring your awareness to the fluid and say hello to it. Recognize it as a part of you, and
Mm.
that's it. That's it. That's all you need to do. That's all you need to do, and see what happens. Just see what happens in your experience, in your own experience of saying hello to this fluid and kind of having an understanding of the parts of the brain that it's contacting to. And that, that's really where I allow them people to do that, and then and then send me emails and be like, whatever it
Yeah,
might be, or connect to, to to make analogies to different things that they've experienced in life. And that's the beauty, is I'm not necessarily, I don't want to like put experiences into people's consciousness. I want it to sort of emerge out of them,
mm,
and to be authentic to you, right? Like, what is your experience of this? Not what my experience is. I know what my experience is, but what's your experience of this? You might be able to tell what my experience is. um, but the point of this is that when you're doing this, that you don't dissociate. Number one, okay, so
mm.
you're not like floating away. Okay,
Yep,
you don't feel like your soul is floating away.
grounded.
Exactly, you're embodied. Okay, this
Yes,
body
yes,
is a
we are.
sacred vessel. It's a
Yes,
totally
yes,
sacred vessel. It's amazing that we're in this body. It's a
yes,
miracle. All right,
totally.
and so feel your feet on the ground throughout this entire process. If simultaneously you're not feeling your feet on the ground as you're connecting to this fluid,
Mm-hmm.
then I encourage you to really just practice feeling your feet on the ground, and
That's great.
simultaneously, for instance, feeling your entire body. So to
Mm-hmm.
me, it's all about staying grounded. It's all about feeling your thighs against the chair, your back against the chair, or if you're lying down, and not becoming disassociated, or not even leaving your body.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually about remaining embodied and connecting to the fluid, and seeing what happens, as a vehicle of transmission of what I call sort of source energy, of the
Yep.
totality of energy that exists in the universe, that unifying energy that is present for all, um, that informs us all. And so, just see what happens. And
Yeah,
that's
brilliant. Yeah, well, that's great advice as well for the simplicity of it and understanding the cerebral spinal fluid as you see it, but understanding that we're all unique. Our experience is going to be very different for each of us, and how we feel and see that is going to be unique to us. But your wisdom and your information and your research upon it all is really helps us understand it on a deeper level. But the simplicity of having your feet on the ground, connecting to the cerebral spinal fluid, and just working with that, just to understand it a little bit more each time is
exactly.
really, yeah, is really basically what you're saying. And I love simplicity. I think it's really important in the world that we live in. We'll leave all the hard research and all the interesting, intricate work to you, but bringing it all back for just the general person that wants to understand the cerebral spinal fluid. It is a fluid. It works through us. It is in our brain. It works through our entire system, is what I felt before I even knew too much about it. I know that you call it some of in your one of your YouTube videos. It's a vehicle of transmission of information that you called it, and there's no. You said there's no synapse. There's synchronization, and it's simultaneous. So it's all sort of happening all at once, but it's becoming quite apparent as you speak, Dr. Zapatero, that it's really simply getting in touch with the ground, connecting, and then connecting to the fluid within you and seeing what comes from there.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's
and
really pretty.
and and I think you
And I'm
hit on a
sending it to
really,
you.
yes, that's it. That's it. Like, that's how simple. Like, that's really how simple. Because um, I, if you're having an authentic experience, and I ground this, I ground all this in the anatomy, right? So I tell people to go, go look at the anatomy of the ventricles, which is why you see anatomy of the ventricles on my talks, for instance.
Yes, yes, that's
Go look
very
at where the
important.
pituitary gland is compared to the pineal gland in the third ventricle.
Yes.
If you feel drawn to the third ventricle in your meditation or in your closing of your eyes or whatever happens, or all of a sudden you feel an energy coalescing there, notice it. Just
Mm,
notice it and
mm,
say
mm, mm.
hello, right?
Yes.
Just say hello. Hello. Wow, what?
Yeah.
Be a 2-year-old that's investigating like a flower for the first time. And just say hello. Whatever you feel, totally authentic to your own experience. And these might be really subtle feelings, but just sort of stay with it. And the more you practice, the more these little subtle feelings will not be so subtle anymore.
Mm,
And just say hello, whatever you feel. If you feel coalescing, if you feel a spreading, um, if you feel a tightening, whatever it is, just be curious at it and just say hello to it and see what happens. But remain grounded. Stay in your chair.
mm.
Have your feet on the ground. Um, and that might be the first process of it is just feeling your feet on the ground, and simultaneously feeling your body, so feeling your feet on the ground and then feeling your body.
Absolutely.
That might be somebody's initial practice of this, and then going in and seeing where, some people might even feel it coalescing in their sacrum, wherever it does, but just being authentic to yourself and knowing that this, you have a physical anatomy in you
Mm,
that has been, that for whatever reason has the shapes and the spaces that they do, and
yeah.
go with, if you start feeling something moving, is it moving in some sort of energetic pattern, or is it actually moving in some sort of anatomic pattern? And you can even flow with that, almost like you're just watching it, right? You're kind of watching it. It might be flowing, or you might start feeling it pulsating or gathering or increasing in intensity or whatever it might be for you. You might feel it going down your spine. You might feel it coming up your spine. You might feel it
Mm,
expanding out. You might feel it, and as you said, this brings me back to what you said, is um, remember, you have extracellular fluid throughout your entire body, right? So
mm,
you might feel it coalescing from the periphery to the center. You might feel it
mm,
from the center to the periphery.
mm.
You
Yes.
might feel it as like a spreading, as for instance, if I took like a food dye, a food color, and put one drop
Mm,
into a bottle of water and watched it just, move, and now all of a sudden you're breathing into that bottle of water, and how the food dye then starts to move. And now that, to me, that's sort of like, if and when you connect to that source, that food dye, that source gets dropped in, boom, it's always there
mhm,
anyways. And then you might feel it sort of going out, and then instantaneously, um, you might feel it, at your fingertips, or at your at your toes, or even sort of beyond your physical body. There may be a sensation of something being beyond your physical body,
absolutely.
in that. And so, you know, we do have extracellular matrix throughout our entire body. And so people may be feeling it also in the extracellular matrix. Once the fluid has been informed and has a certain resonance or frequency to it, that you might feel it in other parts of your body too, or even, a holistic sort of entire body experience.
Yeah. And I suppose the thing to remember is there is no right or wrong way to feel or to do it. It's just to connect to the ground and just be with, be there with yourself and the cerebral spinal fluid and just be grounded at that, because our experiences are also unique.
That is
Um,
absolutely right. Yep.
Yeah. Look, I've probably taken up a lot of more of your time than planned, but I did want to mention, look, you relate the CSF to so many things. It's relatable to the Kundalini and the awakening. I also noticed on the latest blog, I don't know if you write those, But it's there's a metaphor to Frozen 2 and the Kundalini there, which is really interesting. I really would love the listeners to connect to your website because it's a wealth of information. Not only is there a blog, but they can connect to you in relation to their experience. There, there are meditations on there, and that's holdingspace.com, and that's a plethora of information that people can connect to, and to your information that you've studied, and also just YouTube, Google your name, and it'll come up with different things that you've done over the last few years. I'm glad to see that this information is becoming more and more exposed, Dr. Zapatera, because I think it's time. It's obviously time because it's here. And I really felt it was a few years ago now that I initially was looking at your information, and I had a very distinct feeling that you were here to, because your name, anyway, to ground this information and to share it anyway. So I'm so glad that now, 4 years down the track, you are grounding this information in more ways than one, and you're able to share your research, and it's becoming readily available and acceptable and understood, not just by, not just by people like myself who are sitting in a lounge, but by medical researchers, medical doctors are recognizing your research. So thank you so much. So I want to say thank you for your research. Thank you for being inspired back then and following that inspiration, because I think that's where it all starts for the shifts to occur. And you're bringing through so much information that is going to be so important for many of us as we move forward through humanity and evolve to the next stages. So I want to say thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you for your information. I didn't have to ask you anything. You were just a wealth of information. And I just want to ask, as I ask all my guests, if you have one message for the world at this time, what would it be? If you
My
had a
message for the world is
yeah.
go towards love.
Oh, I love it. Yeah, that works. Brilliant. Thank you again, Dr. Mauro Zapatera from holdingspace.com, and for your research. And may you go in peace, and thank you again.
Thank you.